Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington Brazil office. This is episode 64 of Brazil Unfiltered. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Mila Burns, who is an associate professor in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies at Lehman College, the City University of New York. She is the associate director at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She is the author of Dona Ivone Lara's Sorriso, Negro, e Nasci para Sonhar e Cantar, Dona Ivone Lara, a Mulher no Samba. Mila has an interdisciplinary profile with an emphasis on media, anthropology, and history. For over 2 decades, she has worked as a journalist in Brazil and in New York, currently as a political commentator for ICL Notícias. She has served as editor-in-chief and anchor to shows dedicated to the Latino community broadcast at TV Globo International, and has worked at TV Globo, The Economist, Globo, and others. Her current book manuscript investigates the Brazilian influence on the military coup d'etat in Chile in 1973. Her articles have been published in several news magazines, papers, and academic publications. Mila, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, not only because I've been following the podcast, but I've been following you forever. Not only your academic work, but your work as an activist. And we scholars of Brazil are all very, very grateful for everything you've been doing in terms of fighting to declassify documents, but also supporting scholars here in the United States. Thank you so much, Green.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get right to the point. September 11th marks the 50th anniversary of the 1973 coup d'etat in Chile that overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. First, could you give us a brief overview of how Salvador Allende came to power in 1970? Who was he? What was his program?
Sure. I think this is very important for us to really understand what was going on there. Salvador Allende was born in Valparaíso in Chile into a upper-class, middle-class family. He received a medical degree from the Universidad de Chile, the University of Chile, and at this time, during these years as a student around, let's say, 1930s, late 1920s, maybe early 1930s, he became very engaged in politics. He was actually one of the founders of the Chilean Socialist Party. And as you just said, he was elected democratically and was also the first socialist president in Chile. He was at the time the candidate of the Unidad Popular, the Popular Unity, a left-wing political alliance that included most of the Chilean left, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and many others. But Allende became really a politician. He never became a doctor, a physician. He was a politician for decades, served as a congressman, as a minister of health, and was elected senator 4 times in Chile, the first in 1945. He ran for president in 52, 58, 64, and finally was successful in 1970. But that 1970 victory was not at all easy. It was actually a very narrow victory. He secured just over 36% of the vote, while his opponent, Jorge Alessandri, received a little more than 35%. It means that he won with a plurality rather than a majority. And the Chilean constitution determines that in cases like this, Congress should choose one of the 2 first candidates to rule the country. And that's when it starts to become tricky and polarized, right? You know, it's not an easy win. And right there, we already see that things are going to get complicated because Congress named Salvador Allende president only after he signed the Estatuto de Garantías Constitucionales, a statute that basically Christian Democrat politicians proposed, in which Allende promised to preserve the democratic regime. Allende's program had a very, very deep commitment to social and economic reforms, with nationalizing key industries in Chile, especially the copper mining industry, which is, well, up to this day, is a major force in Chilean economy. He also promised to intensify, and I'd like to say that, intensify agrarian reform, because a program of land redistribution had already started under his predecessor, Eduardo Frei. So he promised to make this a real deal and a very important thing in Chile. We can summarize these ideas that were called La Vía Chilena al Socialismo, the Chilean path to socialism, like that. Now, imagine how all of that agrarian reform, equality, nationalization of industries, including copper. Imagine how that sounded to the United States. We're talking about 1970, at the height of the Cold War, when the fear of a new Cuba was constant, the fear of the spread of communism in Latin America was constant. So this really played a decisive role in the external attempts, especially from the US, but including, very importantly, Brazil too, to prevent Allende from becoming president and governing. Not only from the US, as I said, but Brazil too.
So at this period of time in Latin American history, especially in South America, there are authoritarian regimes coming to power in Brazil in 1964, and in 1973, there will be a dictatorship in Uruguay, the dictatorship in Chile, in 1976, the Argentinian dictatorship. There's a sense among youth and sectors of the left that the only way to free Latin America, free South America from oppressive regimes, from authoritarian regimes, from capitalism, is revolution and armed struggle. And yet Salvador Allende is proposing a peaceful road to socialism, not carrying out violent revolution as had taken place in Cuba and other parts of, or attempted to take place in other parts of Latin America. How did people understand this? You mentioned the United States' opposition to this government, but it seems that Allende was not proposing a revolution. He was actually proposing something different.
And actually, he had many opportunities to propose a revolution. He was asked, like, when I say that there were internal issues in Chile too, not only external influences, of course, the right wing was very angry at what was going on. And that means that people who were ruling businesses and the media in Chile were very angry with what was going on. We already mentioned the US and Brazil, but even leftists in Chile were thinking that he was not moving forward fast enough or boldly enough. So they, in their own right, because it was a democracy, were saying, hey, you have to do more, Allende. Come on, where is the revolution? And many asked for him, for instance, when things started to get ugly in episodes like the Tancaso, that was an attempted coup that ended up not going further, asked him to close Congress, like shut down Congress and just start ruling as a leader without the interference of other parties. And Allende refused to do all of that. He refused to arm the population the way the MIR, for instance, and other left-wing groups were really claiming that he did. And sometimes I feel that we don't talk about that enough. We tend to look at this as like, oh, the Fidel Castro who never happened. That's a very, very different approach. I actually like to think of Fidel Castro's visit to Chile as a good example of how different their approaches were, because Fidel gets there really like handsome, young, energetic, and it looks very bad for Allende with the left leaders, especially, who are like, hey, are you the old uncle of this guy? Are you like another historian called him the old uncle? And I love this image of him as someone not as energetic or bold or fast as Fidel Castro. And then Fidel Castro ends up staying there forever. And it becomes also a problem, because it's like, really? This hero image is fading. Is that what we're expecting? So I think Allende was put into a position in opposition to Fidel Castro, especially, as a leader that never would be. Whatever he did, he would not win, because the narrative controlled by the media, the Chilean media and the international media too, was a narrative that it didn't matter what he did. If he didn't do enough, he was not bold enough. If he did, too much, it was a danger. It was a communist scare. So I think this is an important observation to be done too.
So what happened during the years of 71 to 73 before the coup? What were the things that led up to the coup that brought about the military takeover?
Well, this was a period of tremendous political and economic instability. It's really impossible to point to one factor that led to the coup of 1973. And it is good to state that this has been a topic of debate among scholars, politicians, and activists. It's not something that is a done deal. Some will say the US interference was the major cause. Some will say internal problems were the major cause. But I think we should point to many factors: the economy, internal political issues, as we said, US influence, yes, and the public perception of crisis that is actually connected to all of these factors. So first, in economical terms, Allende's government faced significant difficulties. His policies, as I said, aimed to nationalize key industries, and that, of course, led to conflicts with powerful business interests, both domestic and international. Again, copper, U.S. private business has a chunk of money there. There were also shortages of every kind of consumer goods one can think of, like toilet paper. Inflation escalated. And again, why? Some people will say Allende was not a savvy economist or leader. Was it because of him, or was it because of U.S. and international opposition? Now we can even go back to Cuba again and think, is it because of the embargo, or is it because of the dictatorship? And it's impossible to point to one thing. Everything is deeply connected in the case of Chile. But we should remember that the Church Commission in the United States, the 1975 Church Commission, was created after it became public that President Richard Nixon had demanded that the CIA make the Chilean economy scream to prevent Allende from coming to power or to unseat him. So it's clear there that these shortages and economic problems were coming from this place. So external influence is also fundamental, especially the U.S. involvement. The CIA and other U.S. institutions provided support to opposition groups in Chile, worked to undermine Allende's government with propaganda, cover actions that intensified the sensation of crisis and made public opinion really war against Chile. But when we talk about external influence, and I don't want to get there too soon, but it is important to know that part of the playbook that the Chilean right wing used came from Brazil. For instance, the infamous March of the Empty Pots in Chile was basically very connected to El Poder Femenino, an institution that was inspired by the campaign of Women for Democracy in Brazil, an invention of the Institute for Social Studies and Research in 1962. The IPES created in 1962, who opposed the João Goulart government in Brazil. So you see a lot of similarities there in their strategies to oppose those rightfully democratically elected governments.
So you had mentioned an attempt by the military in July of '73 to overthrow the government, which failed, but many argue that it was a test to see if, in fact, who was loyal to Allende, who was not loyal to Allende in the armed forces, to be able to identify those people and then carry out the September 11th, 1973 coup. I will just share with my listeners, I remember very distinctly that day. I was called by a friend in Philadelphia where I was living and told about that. And the next day we were all called to a demonstration in downtown Philadelphia. And that became 2 years for me of intensive solidarity work with Chile from 1973 to 75, when then I moved to Brazil. What happened right after the coup in Chile? What were the conditions of people who had been supporters of the Allende government?
I love this question because there's still a myth, I think, in Chile, as there is in Brazil, that the dictatorship stabilized the country and it was a little bit violent, but was good for the economy and all. Truth is that after the coup, Chile experienced a period not only of tremendous violence and sort of alienation of a large part of the population who were silenced and really detached from the political debate. But the economy was not that successful. We can think of the economy, and when we think of that, of course, we are deeply connecting it to the Chicago Boys, a group of economists that were trained in Chicago under the guidance of American U.S. economist Milton Friedman, who was actually a very proud professor of this group. And they implemented measures like privatization, deregulation, try to shift the country toward a free market economy. Again, it couldn't be more different than Allende's agenda. But these policies did create economic growth at the time, but they also resulted in increased inequality and social disparity, very similar to what happened in Brazil under the dictatorship. Many have the illusion up to this day that the regime created prosperity. It really created room for the terrifying 1980s when the Brazilian economy collapsed. So we have to keep that into perspective. On top of that, I like to talk about the economic factor because people always use that as a but, which should not exist. But on top of that, the country experienced tremendous violence. We know that the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture in Chile and the Radic Commission concluded that there were probably over 40,000 victims of human rights abuses in Chile. Over 2,000 people were executed. But of course, these numbers are not necessarily accurate. There were probably more, because the Pinochet government, at the end of the regime, ordered the destruction of documents, the disappearing of bodies. Many were thrown in the ocean, buried in the desert. We are now hopeful to know more with the initiative of the current government under President Gabriel Boric, who took the responsibility of investigating and giving explanations to the families of the disappeared. But this is a big question. We don't know what happened. And for these families, it is very important. Where are they? Were they killed? How? By whom? Those questions need to be answered. And they can only be answered once the state takes responsibility for what happened. So this is a very important step. This is similar to what we saw in Brazil during the Dilma Rousseff presidency, when the government took responsibility and said, we're going to open a commission to investigate our issues, what we did wrong as a state, not as her government, but during the dictatorship, to give an answer to these people who need and deserve answers. So I think there's a lot to be said about that.
So at the time, during the end of the government, there were a significant number of Brazilians who left Brazil clandestinely to escape imprisonment. A number of 70 of former activists, leftists, were actually who had been imprisoned and tortured, were released with the kidnapping of the Swiss ambassador and flown to Chile in 1971. So there was a significant community of Brazilian exiles in Chile between 71 and 73. What happened to them?
Yeah,
After the coup in 73?
That's a great question. It's very hard to confirm. I like that you use the expression significant numbers. What we know, it's impossible to confirm how many, especially because of the nature of what being a political exile is. It depends many times on secrecy, so on changing your name, your address, and all of that. But at the time, the French newspaper Le Monde estimated that there were around 1,200 Brazilians in the country, which is a very large figure. Later, the committee Carlos Ré for Truth and Justice of Rio Grande do Sul, a state in Brazil, concluded that at least 123 Brazilians were arrested in Chile's national stadium. So you see that the presence of Brazilian exiles and groups that were politically engaged in the fight against the dictatorship in Brazil, which had been established in 1964, were very active in Chile. They ended up in Santiago for many different reasons. Some went because Brasilia expelled them and had some sort of agreement with Chile. Others chose the country because they had friends, they had families, they had professional contacts, especially at universities. So there were many different people. Three major waves. The first one took place right after the 1964 coup and comprised mostly of professors, politicians, and professionals who had just lost their jobs for being considered enemies of the regime in Brazil. The second
that includes Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was
includes Fernando Henrique Cardoso, yes, who was a president in Brazil, and not only that, was at the time a very important sociologist who developed in Chile many of his theories connected to dependency theory, which is probably one of the most influential currents of thought in Latin America. But we also are talking about people like Vânia Bambirra, a very celebrated sociologist in Brazil, and even Paulo Freire, the educator that here in the United States people celebrate so much. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian intellectual who moved to Chile and spent some time there too. There was also a second wave in 1968 at the time of the Institutional Act number 5 in Brazil, when political persecution really became law, basically, and we saw torture, murder, and imprisonments reaching an all-time height during the dictatorship. And maybe the third wave would be that one in the 70s when Salvador Allende is elected. And many people went to Chile in hope of witnessing the development of a nation where these ideals of equality and socialism would be the centerpiece of policymaking.
And so what happened to them after 1973? You said at least 100 were in the National Stadium. Were they able to leave the country? How did they leave the country? What was the condition of the Brazilians in Chile after the coup?
It varies. Many managed to leave the country. In the first days, we have people who are looking for support from international embassies, just like other people. But we also have now documentation of 6 Brazilians who were killed by the Pinochet regime. The ones who went into exile, some went to Mexico, some went to Sweden and other countries in Europe. So the fate of these people was very different. But one thing that is important is that and I have, for instance, an example of Otto Brox, who is was a doctor, passed away recently in Brazil, who went to Chile because he wanted to engage in socialism, volunteered, worked as a doctor there, then went to Africa to fight. He was looking for places where they needed his help in fighting for justice and a more fair regime to all. So you had all kinds of people, but no matter who they were, I see something in common, which is after they left Chile, they engaged in movements in which they were questioning issues of gender equality, racial equality, and they really were much closer to those debates wherever they were, in the United States, in France, where all of those questions of civil rights were emerging. And when they went back to Brazil in 1979, mostly, or after that, after the amnesty law in Brazil was approved, they brought with them those questions and those issues. So that's when these debates really intensify in Brazil, when the fight for human rights in Brazil becomes not only a fight against the dictatorship, but a fight for equality in many different fields. So this is a group that is really, really important in forging Brazil as a democracy, once Brazil becomes a democracy too. They're very connected to what happened in Chile. The fact that they witnessed 2 coups made a major impact in the way they perceive themselves and perceive the world, the system, capitalism, and injustices that they saw both in Chile and in Brazil.
Many people who went to exile into Chile and then later went to Europe came back to Brazil, in my observation, becoming Latin Americanists, because traditionally the elites and the middle class looked to Europe for this reference. The elites at the turn of the 20th century certainly saw France as the paradigm country in the world, and this turn to Latin America was very much a part of the experience of the Chilean period of Salvador Allende and afterward. Did you notice that in your research, this kind of Latin Americanization of Brazilians and looking towards Latin America as a connection to as a reference point?
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because for me, as a Brazilian of a younger generation, I was born in 1980. So I was born under the dictatorship still, but as a child under the dictatorship. And for me, the idea of us as Latin Americans was a very foreign one. We could listen to the songs, like especially Sangue Latino and songs that talked about us as Latin Americans, but all of those songs were connected to that period, not to my childhood in Brazil. So there was a kind of oblivion right after the starting of the process of turning ourselves again into a democracy after this violent period of dictatorship. And I think that when I started interviewing the exiles for my forthcoming book, I really realized how that was the center of their way of thinking about themselves in terms of Brazilian identity. It was not as a Brazilian only, but as part of this area, this region that faced similar histories of oppression, be it with colonialism, be it with US interference, or even European influence in education and things like that. There was a will and a search for an identity that was way more connected to Latin America. So I remember them singing songs from Latin America, like Victor Jara was a big one, but Violeta Parra was also a big one. Like during the interview, they would refer to songs, refer to experience, refer to food. Oh, and I was there eating my empanada, and I was, wow, this is so powerful that they continue to talk about that and continue to have that as a part of their Brazilian identity.
Wow. So your doctoral dissertation at the City University of New York was entitled Dictatorship Across Borders, How Brazil Influenced the Chilean Coup d'etat of 1973, which now is a manuscript soon to be published. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your findings? I don't know if the title has changed. You might want to share that with us.
We don't know yet. We don't know about that yet. The title is still there. I don't have a title as good as yours, Jim. You're the master of titles. Maybe I should call you afterwards and see if you have a suggestion.
Be glad to talk to you about it. I spend a lot of time when I'm taking showers thinking of book titles.
Yeah, let's do that. So yeah, but it's funny because we talked before I started my research in 2012. I can tell everyone how grateful I am to you too, because you were one of my advisors when I was doing my master's at Columbia University. And right as soon as I embarked in the process of doing a PhD, we talked, and you were really like worried, but very cheerful, saying like, I don't know if you're going to find the documents. I don't know what you're going to find, but let's trust serendipity and see, maybe this is going to happen. And it turns out there were many documents, many were not there, but I managed to interview so many voices of people who were involved with this process. And I do think that us as historians, we have to be very careful with the use of oral histories and interviews and memory, but we should not disregard that as a source either, because documents are also part of the creation of human beings and memories too. So those things I think should be combined. And what we have from documents is very strong evidence, and that combined with what we're hearing from exiles and torturers and spies, I heard all of them for this project. So that gives us a picture of how big of an influence Brazil had. Richard Nixon and Médici, Emílio Garrastazu Médici, the Brazilian then president, met in 1971 and talked clearly in Washington about the situation in Chile and agreed to act. It was not like them saying, oh, maybe, what do you think? It was them agreeing to open a secret line of communication to which nobody, not even the typist, Médici said, would have access, so that they could decide what to do about Chile that worried them both. But Brazil was already worried about Chile much earlier, even before Allende's election, actually. When he was a candidate in 1964, they were already talking. In 66, Brazilian leaders met with Gabriel Valdés, then Chilean Ministry of Foreign Relations, and asked about Allende, asking for reassurance that Allende would not let a socialist man become president. So Brazil tried for years to undermine the Allende administration and acted actively towards that, whether working with the US or independently. Brazil had an intelligence service of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, the CX, which was kept a secret for a long time, but these were people spying on supporters of the Chilean socialist leader. Brazil also sent torturers to the national stadium, sent medicine, sent weapons. That's all documented there. Allende was very careful not to create a diplomatic crisis with Brazil, and we see that in the documents too, but his support for Brazilian exiles was pretty much enough to intensify these tensions between the two countries. This monitoring of Brazilian exiles there, I think it's very important for us to understand the scope of that. Those exiles lived in permanent state of distrust and anxiety. They saw that they were being spied all the time, not only by moles, people who were infiltrated, but like people who look like military men walking around Santiago and looking for them. This is a network that for me is like a proto Operation Condor, you know, which is this association between dictatorships in South America and the US to look, identify, and eliminate enemies of those authoritarian regimes. Brazil was already implementing a network of investigation and spying before that. The country was also connected to Chilean groups who opposed Allende, including the Federation of Chilean Industry, the SOFOFA. I talked to Orlando Sanz, who was the then president of the SOFOFA, a very powerful man in Chile, very anti-communist man in Chile, and he confirmed in details all those interactions. So political repression, intelligence services, all of those things were used to intimidate the opposition and weaken Salvador Allende. And of course, I would be very unfair if I forgot to mention the Brazilian ambassador to Chile at the time, Antonio Câmara Canto, known for some as the fifth man in the Chilean junta. That was how close he was to them. And on the day of the coup, he sent several telegrams to Brasilia celebrating the violent events, celebrating violence. But also on September 7th, he gave a room of the Brazilian embassy in Santiago for these people to reunite, to meet, and sent a telegram to Brazil informing them of the big names that were there. So there's a lot there.
So how do we understand this? It's a moment very curious that in 74, Geisel will begin the process known as distinção, which will eventually be known as abertura, where the Brazilian government is trying to find a way to exit power without losing power or without having any measures taken against them for the gross violation of human rights. But at the same time that they're leaving power, they're supporting a dictatorship in Chile. How can we understand this seemingly contradictory policy of one hand being democratic and moderate or moving towards democracy in Brazil, slowly but surely, but at the same time supporting, at the time, the most authoritarian regime in Latin America?
Yeah, that's very important. And we can think of that too if we look at the timeline, because we're talking about 73, 74, 75, Operation Condor, all those years. And Brazil only really ends this long process in 85. So this was not something that, okay, now we're not dealing with these people anymore. There's still people who are supporting those views, who are supporting violence, maybe trying to open dialogue, maybe trying to see that the country is not as strong as it used to be, and feeling this fragilization of the regime. But it is important to understand that the Brazilian support was not only important to overthrow Allende, but was also instrumental for the solidification of the Augusto Pinochet regime. So for instance, when the Soviet Union canceled the export of wheat to Chile a month after the coup, the United States opened a line of credit to allow the country to buy wheat, and Brazil went beyond. A few days later, Brazil donated a ship full of corn flour to replace that. It also sent tons of sugar as soon as Cuba cut exports to the country, and even redirected to Santiago bags of that had already been sold to other buyers. The Emilio Garrastazu Médici government opened a line of $50 million unrestricted financial credit to Chile. After that, Argentina did not want to lag too far behind and offered another 25 million. So we see how all of those dictatorships are acting to support this new friend and this regime that all of a sudden is not a menace anymore. It's actually someone who is very close to their ideals. The Brazilian military fueled the National Stadium, the main center of murder and violence in the first months of the Chilean dictatorships. They sent, as I said, medical supplies, but they also sent torturers. And we have the Brazilian exiles telling us, different Brazilian exiles who were there, telling us how these people, worked. And they simply were like guiding and teaching Chileans how to torture others to get the best answers from them. It was creeping. And, you know us, Jim, when we're walking around the world, we can recognize Brazilians. They don't even need to speak. We know, well, that's one of us. And they recognize Brazilians, and in some cases even listen to them speaking Portuguese. But most of the time they were just there watching and guiding these torturers. So Brazil really not only served as, giving the playbook to those right-wing institutions, but also in practice, being there to teach these torturers how to act. When Pinochet needed to expand its arsenal, Brasilia sent weapons from its own arms reserves, with the Brazilian coat of arms carefully erased, by the way, as an acknowledgement of the need to hide that support. So I think this is an important example of that. They understood the need to hide the support because this transition was already starting to take shape, but they supported nevertheless. And so this is an intriguing moment. Ultimately, I would say the Brazilian government provided money, weapons, medicine, expertise, intelligence reports, and tortures, of course, to the enemies of the Allende government and to support the Pinochet regime.
So if you recall, in 2016, during the impeachment vote of Dilma Rousseff in the House, the Câmara de Deputados, Jair Bolsonaro, who was not really well known nationally at the time, got up and defended the revolution of 1964, the dictatorship's term for the coup of 1964, and the torturer who oversaw the torturing of Dilma Rousseff. When he became president, on numerous occasions, he made comments about defending Pinochet and praising the coup of 1973. How can we understand that? And what are the implications for a Brazilian president saying that to the public, to the world community?
Yeah, we could never forget that horrible moment. First, I think it obviously shows a disconnection and ignorance of our own history. But it also, I think, going a little further, demonstrates he could be an example of how some Brazilians don't understand this chapter in our history. That's why I think maybe you, Jim, should start a project really reshape the way we see that, and maybe a new book or something like that, a more accessible one, so that people can finally get a hold of what's going on and what happened with us. I think that people, and this is a cliche, but it's really true. If we don't know what happened, if we don't really understand our history, we commit this kind of atrocities. And when I say atrocities, is not the atrocity that Jair Bolsonaro committed when saying that, but us electing a man like him, who openly says something like that, and then people vote for him. And I think that really demonstrates a lack of understanding of not only the violence, but how economically the regime was horrible, was not a synonym of prosperity at all, and how problematic this period, this chapter in our history is. And I think this is something that happens to both Brazil and Chile. Both countries still struggle with the heritage of the dictatorships that ruled the countries. Let's think of Chile too. In 2020, they rushed to the polls in the midst of a pandemic to scrap the constitution designed under the Pinochet administration, and we know what happened with that. They kept it going on. The discussion is already ongoing because the vote was not what people expected. The previous years were marked by the Estallido Social de Chile, when hundreds of people occupied the streets of Santiago to protest against neoliberal policies. And then we see them voting for Sebastián Piñera. So, it's very hard for us to understand those dynamics, and we see how the right wing in both countries is still gaining strength. But I do think that in the case of Brazil, it is very important for us to think of Jair Bolsonaro as not only someone who lacked administrative qualifications, but because he approved basically 2 projects during his 27 years as a congressman, but someone who also paid homage, as you said, to the military regime multiple times. I think this is the demonstration that in a period of tremendous political tension and polarity that we're seeing in the US, in Chile, and in Brazil, it is important for us to keep talking about that. It is important for us to keep investigating that. It's very scary for someone like me who, I have stories of like sitting down with exiles who didn't want to talk to me. And this is today because they thought, because of my last name, because my name is Burns and no connection with no one in the US, my grandfather happened to be Scottish, but they didn't want to sit and talk to me because they thought I could be a CIA spy. And in one case, I had to take my husband with me to talk to them. That's the level of trauma we're talking about. And people today in Brazil have a complete, not everyone, but some people still have a complete disconnect with what happened during the dictatorship, the level of violence, and how horrible it was for the country as a whole, not only for many individuals, which would be more than enough for us to never want to revive that again, let alone celebrate it, but also for many. But, one thing that I wanted to say, though, is that I think the brainwashing that those regimes did, and many people who were under those regimes are still here with us, are still alive. My parents are there. Was a very effective one too. Like, one small thing that I always think of is how they taught generations to call it a revolution. The revolution of 1964, not the coup. And I hear that from left-wing people today. Oh, because when the revolution took place, because they kept repeating it over and over again. And sometimes these people don't even realize that they're calling one of the most violent moments of our history revolution. So this positive tone, I think, is something we really have to be fighting against all the time. And remember ourselves, telling the story to our kids and in schools and wherever we can.
I can't end this conversation without having one last question about you as a professional journalist, because you have a very distinguished career as a journalist of many, many years. People in Brazil know of you because of your transmissions from New York. And then you decided to take a radical turn and become an historian, a risky business, because no guarantee of getting a job at the end of the rainbow. But you did that, and you're now an associate professor, and you have a fabulous career ahead of you, and book coming out soon. What did you bring to history from your experiences in journalism that helped you be successful?
Honestly, Jim, I don't think it was intentional. I didn't know how to do it because I've been trained as a journalist for many, many years. Therefore, it was very, very hard for me to really embrace all the methodological approaches that historians carry in this country. And I just accepted that I would fail miserably from time to time. And I ended up really embracing that. And I think what I bring is precisely the fact that I'm still a journalist. So oral history is a big part of my work. I love interviewing. I still do many of those things. Like tomorrow, I'll be at the Graduate Center with a Brazilian singer, interviewing her. In October, I'll be with Paquito de Rivera, interviewing him at the Graduate Center. So it's my academic institution, and I'm there sort of as a journalist, but sort of as an academic. I don't see myself as someone who, I tried, you know that I tried a few times to fight against that and just be a historian, but I am an interdisciplinary thinker, and I can only do things like that. I'm also an anthropologist. I have a master's at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, the Universidade Federal of Rio de Janeiro, the federal university there. So I think I borrow from all of those perspectives, and I try to do something with that. And again, that doesn't mean that it's better. I frequently fail, but it means that it's my way of doing things, and I think sometimes it works.
As a person who's done more than 250 oral histories in my own work, I think it's wonderful, and the influence in anthropology makes your work, our work, much richer in really understanding the complexities of humans, how they relate to the history and the historical process. So I want to really thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. This has been a fabulous interview. You're extremely articulate and able to explain very complex process in a very concise way. It's been really wonderful having you here with us today.
I'm really glad to hear that, because really, I'm not easily intimidated, but talking to you is always like, oof, really? Not only a pleasure, but really, really intimidating. I'm a big fan.
I'm sorry that I did that. I don't know. I don't mean to. Let me tell you.
You can't help. There's nothing you can do about that, Jim. But thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for the work you've been doing as a scholar with your books. You mentioned oral histories, and whenever I reread one of your books, that's when I see I'm failing miserably, because my interviews go over so many things, and then in the end, I'm like, oh, okay, that's what I was expecting. And I see your work as an example to all of us. So thank you for your work, producing books, producing knowledge, sharing that with us at the WBO too, and how important that has been for Brazilian scholars all over the world. So we really appreciate you, and of course the podcast as well. I'll continue following you wherever you are. Thank you.
You're so kind. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you enjoy the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.